Hello, welcome. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay, yeah, very good. Well, welcome to the Financial Inclusion Forum CDC event on impact investing and how to do it at scale. We have hopefully a good session for you. A number of people will be turning up as we go, but we better start because we've got people joining us online who've been patiently waiting. And I believe we're going to open from a colleague of ours from CDC, Dowdy Lilefelt, will open up as a note from CDC. Dowdy.
I don't think I need that. Do I? Or do you need it for the live streaming? Okay, yes. Thank you. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the CDC. And I understand that we're honored for this to be the inaugural meeting of the Financial Inclusion Forum, where we as CDC are the sponsors. So I guess we're lucky. We're the lucky ones. You're also very lucky, apparently, because there's a waiting list as big as the size of this room. So hopefully all those others that said they were coming will come, because there was a lot of disappointed people out there, which must point to the testament of this organization. My name is Dowdy Lilefelt. I manage the Impact Accelerator at CDC. And I understand that this meeting today is addressing or has as a title, Can Impact Investing Scale? And I hope so, as I have $500 million that says it can in the facility that I manage here at CDC. I was told to be brief, and I was told to be provocative. Actually, the latter bit is not true, but I'm going to be anyway. So for the time when you are having a glass of wine, maybe there's a couple of things that you might want to mull over that I can plant in your heads now. The word impact. Does it really mean repackaging a whole bunch of deals that are done that tick an SDG box and then call it an impact fund? Let's think about that, because I really would not want the word impact to get downgraded to repackaging. Secondly, market distortion and market failure. It always amazes me how many times I get asked, oh, but Dowdy, with your facility, aren't you scared about distorting markets? The reality is, if something isn't getting financed, what market am I distorting? The market doesn't exist if it's not getting financed. Therefore, we should stop angsting about it and crack on and make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I on? Yes. Thank you, Dowdy. And Dowdy runs a very interesting program here and has a background working for, if I'm right, Barry Callebaut and Cargill, and you may or may not know those organizations, but if you're in the supply chain, you would, and they certainly do things at scale. So thank you for that. Welcome, everyone, and welcome on the live stream. I'm Paul. I'm a director at Financial Inclusion Forum. My day job is investing for impact. I'd like to thank the CDC for hosting us and for their generosity and sponsorship. Pardon me. So I'd like to put you to work, actually. Please would you take out your mobile phone. And type in to open up your email. Pardon me? Oh, yes, very good. So yes, the wireless code is CDC guest, and the password is the number 2, capital C, capital J. So 2, create jobs. So 2, number 2, capital C, REATE, capital J, OBS. You can open up an email and type in our address, which is admin, ADMIN, at financialinclusionforum.org.uk, which is financialinclusionforum.org.uk. And the kicker is, I'd like you to put in the subject line, pledge. And if you think this evening has been a good event, then please send us a note with your pledge and we will contact you later to follow up on that. So, thank you again for coming. What's great is this event has been oversubscribed, which is fabulous. And why has it been oversubscribed? Well, the first thing to note is that there's only one pale, male, and stale person on this panel, and they're not actually speaking. So it's a delight to host a panel that is female-dominated and not full of 40 to 50-year-old pale, male, and stale blokes. The next thing that is great is our panel. That's why you've turned up, actually. So I will introduce them briefly. I'll describe the event that we're going to follow, and then hopefully we'll have some Q&A. So please do make a note of questions, and we will have Q&A at the end. So we will start with an overview of impact investing globally. We will then go into 3 areas, specifically housing, financial inclusion, and energy, so that we can do a little bit of a dive into different areas of investment, and then we'll have Q&A. So that's the overall structure. That will last for about an hour or so. We'll then have about half an hour of Q&A, and then there'll be an opportunity to have a drink and network after. That okay? Make sense? Very good. So, who do we have? Which stars have you turned up to see? Well, first of all, we have Alison Fort, who's Managing Director of Tonic Network. And you'll learn more about Tonic a little bit from Alison. Tonic is absolutely fantastic. One of my jobs is to be the Investment Director of Panopore. We're a member. If you want to talk to me later about it, I will. It's just a fantastic group to be part of and to network with. And she's going to speak, as I say, a lot about the overview of impact investing generally. Then we have a star in Jyoti Patel. Jyoti is the Director of Capital Markets at Habitat for Humanity. I'm absolutely fascinated by her program. I think it's brilliant, and I think we may well have a future event just on that specifically. So I'm really looking forward to what she has to say. We then have Maria, who really doesn't need any introduction, particularly in this room. Maria is well known to many of you. She's a longtime friend of Financial Inclusion Forum. She's head of the financial institutions sector team here at CDC and has a long track record in microfinance investing. And I can't think of a better person to talk about that type of investment. So thank you, Maria. And then we have Ali Khan Jamal, who I know less well. So the pressure's on him to follow those 3. But there we go. But I'm led to believe that he's... Sorry? Yeah, I needed a... You're the token guy. He's always a token guy, you know? Ali Khan is a partner at Dalberg, who many of you will know, strategic advisory firm, does a lot of fascinating stuff. But broadly speaking, Ali Khan spends a lot of time moving a lot of money from the north to the south, if you understand that phrase, in agriculture and infrastructure, but also within energy. And he's going to talk a lot about some of the interesting opportunities to invest in energy. So, without further ado, I will pass on to Alison, who I must say, unfortunately, we're very lucky to have her. She really shouldn't be here. She should be somewhere else, but she's going to give a little bit of her time, but then she's going to have to disappear. So you'll have to contact her by email should you want to speak to her later. All right?
Please do, yes.
So, Alison,
thank you. That's the final slide. So thank you, Paul. Thank you for inviting me. And it's wonderful to be here to a full room and to a live stream, which is a little bit daunting, but my daughter will be very impressed. So I'll have much to talk about when I get back. So Paul sort of asked me to do this, and he has spoken for me many times at my work at Tonic. So I said, yes, I'd be delighted to. And then he said, you need to lay out the whole picture of impact investing for a group that doesn't usually talk about impact investing. So I said, well, I can talk about how we see it, and I can give some sort of, some statistics and some detail around the work that we do. and we'll take it from there. So as Paul mentioned, Tonic is a global impact investing network. Our members are across the globe, as I said, global, and I manage Europe and the Middle East out of London. And our members are all aligned in that they are wanting to connect their capital with their values. So they're looking to achieve a sort of an impact that is in line with their values, and we work with them and work with that community to do so. Part of our membership have made a commitment to move 100% of a portfolio into impact. So looking to achieve impact across a portfolio. And there is 4 billion committed in that community. And that community has shared data with us, so which I can now share with you, to give you a picture of what they are seeing, what they're investing in, and how they're thinking, to give you a landscape overview from their perspective. And there are 2 reports that we have, which you can go away and download, that are freely available, that I will be focusing on. So the first is the T100 launch report, and that is an analysis of 51 portfolios, all committed to impact. And the second is an analysis working with 37 intermediaries and consultants that are acting in the space, hearing from them about their experiences, how the sector has evolved, what they're seeing. So I'll be able to draw on those 2. So that's Tonic, but of course, Tonic is much better with a little bit of gin. So I'm going to put in a dash of gin and share some findings from the gin community as well, which I'll tell you a little bit about as we get further on. And hopefully that will serve as a perfect aperitif to the main course that the rest of the panel will share with you. So who are the 100% impact investors? And I think it's key for me to tell you about sort of the constituency group that we're talking about and that I'm talking about and are closest to when I think about impact investing. And those are the high net worth individuals, the family offices, and the foundations. When we look at GIN, as I talk about a little bit later, that is much more focused on the institutions, and indeed 67% of the respondents for the detailed survey that I'll share with you from their perspective are institutions. So the asset sizes range from the smallest is $1.5 million, and the largest is north of 300 million in the survey. So just to put it into context, sort of a range of asset sizes are represented. And as I said, it is global, but it is predominantly North America and Europe that I'm talking about so far in the 51. We're extending it. We do have some from Asia, from Australia and the Middle East. And as our community grows and we gather more data, we can share more data on the rest of the world perspectives with you too. So the first point I want to make is that impact investors, 100% impact investors, are investing across asset classes in our community. So impact investing is not an asset class. They are seeking to find impact in all investments that they're doing. And this picture I have here is the aggregate picture of those 51 portfolios by asset class. So you can see that you do have the sort of the largest proportion in public equities, but then heavily followed by private equity just on its tail, which if we were looking at a traditional portfolio wouldn't normally be that large, but I'm sure you'll hear from the panel that a lot of impact investment opportunities are in that private asset class. They're also investing across a range of impact themes, and we've got some great panelists to dive into their themes and just to talk about the investment opportunities in their themes later this evening. But here you can see, again, of those 51 portfolios, what's the aggregate picture? What are impact investors investing in? And the largest is environment, followed by cross-sector and poverty alleviation. And they're also in diverse geographies. So, our members are investing across the globe. And in fact, you can see it's quite a complicated diagram, but, for the US and Canada, for example, actually the majority, there's a home bias. The majority of the investments that they're making for impact are in their home geography. And the Europeans have the most diverse portfolios by geography. But again, this is just make the point I'd like to make is that impact investors are finding impact investments in all geographies. It's not only developing markets that they're seeking to have impact. And I mentioned the advisor and intermediary report, and that's what this chart comes from. And what we have seen from working with our members is that as the client demand is growing, and as sort of the investment opportunity, the impact investment opportunity universe is growing, so is the depth and the diversity of the offering that we're seeing from impact intermediaries. And I think our panel may touch on sort of the intermediary space a little bit here as well. So the 4 areas that our members are working with intermediaries on, as you can see here, impact strategy advice, impact policy development, asset management, and impact due diligence. And that is, as I say, has broadened and deepened over the last few years as client demand has increased. Financial returns. So from our detail, the targets are diverse. We have members that are looking for sub-market return, market return, and also capital preservation. And the good news is that 80% of those in the survey have reported that their financial return expectations are being exceeded or met. There are challenges in our space, and that is actually sort of what our community spends most of its time talking about. We want to achieve impact, we want to deploy capital, how can we do that? And these are the challenges that came back. So both from the intermediary perspective and the investor perspective, overcoming performance myths is the #1 challenge that they're facing. And then I also want to touch on, from a member impact investor perspective, immature impact measurement and the challenge around impact measurement. It's still a work in progress. Only 40% of our members are currently measuring and are happy with sort of how they're measuring. In fact, actually happy, they're all sort of pushing it. So I think even happy is probably a stretch, but they're at least sort of on the road of measuring. But 90% want to be measuring. So they're on that journey and they're constantly looking for better ways to do this and working with their intermediaries to do so. So here's the gin added into my tonic. For those of you that don't know the gin, so the gin is another community, it's a global impact investing network. And they are now on their 7th annual survey. And the assets under management in their survey has continued to grow. So they're now talking about 114 billion and 209 respondents that completed their survey. And their findings are similar to ours. It's, as I said, different constituency group to remind. Ours are high net worth individuals, family offices and foundations. That 67% of theirs were fund managers. But their universe is seeing demand growing, seeing the sector growing, they're optimistic, they're seeing that financial performance targets are being met, and they're also seeing that the impact investors are investing globally. So thanks to Paul, I've been able to have a gin chart in my tonic presentation. Thanks, Paul. So you can see here sort of the geographical mix according to sort of the gin community and their impact investors. And they're also investing across sectors. And this is a great slide for this evening's event because the top 3 sectors, and it's very small to see, housing, energy, microfinance. We have it right here for you. So in summary, I just want to, the points I'd like to make, both from the work that we've done with high net worth individuals, families and foundations, and the work that the GIN are continuing to publish, you can see that impact investing is growing, and it is growing in multiple geographies. The investors are actively putting capital to work in multiple geographies across asset classes. And there's a wide range of asset sizes now being sort of represented by our 2 communities. Both impact and financial return expectations can be met. But as I said, impact measurement remains a work in progress. And I can vouch for our community when I say that it is an industry priority. This is sort of what we're spending our time talking and thinking about. And the sector continues to grow, and it's client demand that is growing, that is leading that sector growth. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
So thank you, Paul, and thank you to CDC for this opportunity to talk about Habitat for Humanity's work in the impact investment space. So for those of you who are less familiar with Habitat for Humanity, its name is synonymous with affordable housing. Since 1976, it has provided housing solution to families across the globe and the US. And It has provided intervention in housing solutions. So most people would not have imagined Habitat for Humanity doing impact investment, but here we are. It, in US, it is the largest private sector home builder, and it has done this through 1,400 affiliates that work across the communities in the United States. So I'm going to leave you with some staggering statistics today. One of the first challenges that we see in the affordable housing space is that 1.6 billion people live in inadequate shelter, and they have no means. So most people that live in low-income countries, they build incrementally. And when you look at the statistics, you wonder why a large part of work has not been done. You look at, because it's beyond the reach of government philanthropy alone. So the role of local market becomes really critical to provide some intervention. Now, 20% of the household in developing countries have access to finance through microfinance institutions and others. For rest, they have to look at informal mechanisms of saving and credit from microfinance institution. But when you look at the global portfolio of microfinance institution, you notice that they are mostly devoted to income generation or small and medium enterprises. Although practitioners estimate that about 10 to 20% of the loans that are taken for micro enterprise are diverted towards housing. So there you have the statistics. Now, when you look at the CGAP and the World Bank report, so CGAP is the research and the advisory arm of World Bank. When you look at their report, of the total lending portfolio of microfinance institution, that totals about 45 billion across 200 million customers, only 2% is dedicated towards housing. So why Habitat is doing what it is doing? Well, we want to make the market for housing more efficient and effective so that it can address the needs of low-income household. Most households don't have access to mortgages. They don't have access to even micro mortgages because of the collateral requirement. Now, what we find that with microfinance institution, we are able to start like microfinance, starting with microfinance institution that has the ability to lend. We find that housing microfinance can be a very nimble tool to address the problem of substandard housing, as well as provide a financially viable product to microfinance institution to enter the space. Typically, you look at microfinance institution portfolio, they are mostly devoted to micro enterprise loans. So they are shorter term loans, whereas housing is a capital intensive product. So it requires longer term capital, larger loan sizes. So in order to make housing finance work more effectively, housing market work more effectively, Habitat for Humanity decided to launch a program called the Microbuild Fund. With the combination of advisory services as well as capital, we hope that we will be able to grow the portfolio to a substantial size. So the CGAP report says only 2% is dedicated towards housing. Our goal with this fund and the interventions that we hope to do is to move that needle from 2% to 10% in housing, which would imply an additional $3.6 billion into affordable housing space. In 2012, August, we launched the Microbuild Fund. It is a $100 million fund, which is divided into 10 million of equity and 90 million of capital from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. This is a US government's arm that does funding in emerging market economies. The 10 million of equity is Habitat being a sponsor of the fund. 51% of the equity is held by Habitat. Omidyar Network is another investor which has interest in the property rights space, so that they have invested at a portion of equity. We have MetLife Foundation who has invested, and then finally Triple Jump has invested a minority stake. They are also the fund's manager. Now, because this is a housing fund and because we want to demonstrate the commercial viability and the scale opportunity of housing microfinance as a separate loan product, we also have committed as Habitat, the sponsor of the fund, 10 million in technical assistance. So this 10 million in technical assistance ranges from the gamut of providing market mapping exercise, market research to financial institution, pilot rollout, refinement of product, monitoring and evaluation. But because this fund is highly leveraged, 90 million is provided by OPIC. We want to make sure we pay them back. So we have a component of guarantees, which is a standby letter of credit. That is a first loss guarantee, which is fully committed by Habitat. So at $100 million, 10% of the fund is towards SBLC, 10% is towards technical assistance. Now, why have microfinance institutions not gone into the space? We wonder, right? Because microfinance has been a great movement. It started providing loans to the unbanked. What we found in our research were three main barriers. The first one being the availability of long-term capital. Most financial institutions, because of the type of loans they provide, don't have access to longer-term, larger size capital. The second one being the inability of microfinance institution to develop a technically complex product like housing. And finally, which is even more critical, is the lack of security of tenure. When you look at the borrowing clients that borrow housing loans, you find that they have lived on that property for 10, 20 years, but they don't have title to that land. So these three elements really make housing microfinance as a big barrier. And our job is to break that barrier down. So after it launched, now we are 5 years into this fund. And as of date, I can talk about impact. We have already deployed 77 million in 43 institutions across 26 countries. We have 91,000 families have been able to access housing microfinance loan as a product in itself. Also, when you look at the performance of the portfolio itself for the microfinance institution, we couldn't be more surprised. The housing microfinance portfolio at risk is almost 200 basis points lower than the typical general portfolio of microfinance institutions. So all our investees today, when we look at their collective portfolio at risk, it's 2.04% compared to their overall portfolio PAR of 4.62%. But more importantly, for us, it was the ability to demonstrate the viability and the scale opportunity of microfinance, housing microfinance as a separate loan product. We couldn't be more surprised by the results of the amount that microfinance institutions have been able to unlock. So for example, the $75 million that we put in has now unlocked almost 200 million additional capital for the microfinance institution. Well, where have they sourced it from? The fact that a well-designed housing microfinance product has been able to mitigate the risk of a longer-term, larger-sized loan has been proven effective. And so most MFIs have been able to grow their portfolio beyond the typical like 8 to 10%. Most of our 43 institutions have at least a double-digit portfolio that is as a percentage of their total offering. So that's the demand side of what Habitat is doing. Well, there is also the supply side where Habitat has started a small fund, which is called the Shelter Venture Fund. Now that is looking at providing longer term capital in all forms, which is conducive for the social entrepreneur to take. The social entrepreneurs are basically engaged in providing products and services that are in the affordable housing space. So anybody could be making, like we have a social entrepreneur in India that is creating roofing material from ag waste and packaging material. We have an entrepreneur in Rwanda that is creating flooring using flaxseed and other material that would replace mud flooring, which has been the cause of infectious diseases across homes in Rwanda. We have a solar company. We have a pay-as-you-go utility service in Mexico. So this is a small fund, but the idea is to create both a holistic solution from both demand and the supply side of the housing value chain, and thereby slowly and surely bring more solution to the families across the globe. I'll stop there and then wait for questions. Thank you so much.
Maybe before I start, just a plug for the forum in two ways. I think, firstly, with CDC, we've been trying to crack the affordable housing nut for quite some years and have put some resources towards this, whether it's looking at our microfinance institutions that are trying to enter, as Jody explained, or working with partners like Lafarge and having them come downscale. And we had never connected with Jody before this panel. So, just one of the many reasons I think collaboration out of these types of events can be quite useful. But also my personal story. 8-9 years ago, I think I was working at JP Morgan, and I came to one of these events and met Phyllis and Malcolm Harper, and was introduced to Opportunity International, which is when I made my change from, I guess, the dark side of banking to microfinance. So for me personally, it's quite something to be hosting this event tonight at CDC. So thank you all for coming. But I'm here to talk about the financial inclusion angle of impact investing, and everybody here is pretty knowledgeable in that sector. So I'm certainly not going to spend too much time talking to you about things that you already know, but we'll be looking at this through the lens of scalability. And particularly at CDC, what we've learned as we've tried to invest a pretty sizable amount of money into the financial inclusion sector over the last 15 years. And what we think has worked and what our challenges have been. So this is a chart I created to internally sort of educate people on the evolution of microfinance. But I put it up here today because while I think financial inclusion is one of the more evolved subsectors within impact investing, and I think was named as the second largest specific subsector by Allison within impact investing. It hasn't been a linear journey, right? I mean, microfinance started in the 60s. I think it was a very early sort of warming to the idea of lending and this being correlated to economic development. But then very quickly got momentum, and I think with the UN year of microcredit in 2005, sort of the peak, it became the darling of development, if you will, for a number of years. But then there was a lot of criticism, and you had the AP crisis, you had some issues of a lot of private investor money coming in and increasing valuations. You had some suicides, unfortunately, that were correlated to microfinance. And there was a period where there was a lot of, I think, necessary scrutiny on the sector. And people realized quite quickly that this wasn't going to be a silver bullet to poverty alleviation, and that it was actually quite a dangerous tool if misused. And I think where we've ended up today is the right balanced view, which is there's been new regulations put in place that have been quite useful. There is more emphasis on client protection, making sure that products are tailored towards the needs of the clients, and that it's not the be all end all of development, and that it's one tool of many that's needed to accomplish what we're all trying to accomplish. But the point being, it hasn't been a completely straightforward journey. In more recent years, though, since I think we've had this correction, if you will, we've had a steady growth of investments into the financial inclusion sector. And the last record from CGAP 2015 is $35 billion invested. At CDC, we've invested over $300 million into financial inclusion since 2003. Now, that's across multiple products. Again, Allison teed me up quite well because as she alluded to, the vast majority of that has been into either private equity or private equity funds. But we've done a bit of debt as well in recent years, local currency being a constant challenge, which I'm sure so many of you in the room can sympathize with. So what I tried to do here was pull out the key growth drivers for why I think that we've been able to build some scale within the financial inclusion sector, at least within CDC's portfolio. And if I look at the big success stories, there's three broad themes that I've seen, especially in the last 5 years. The first is around product diversification. So our most successful entities are those that have been able to adapt their products according to client needs, and also in the landscape of changing regulatory regime, right? So I'll take Equitas. I put Equitas here as an example here, who's one of our investees. After the AP crisis, because of the margin caps that were introduced by the RBI, the regulator in India, and also because of the high risk or low asset quality or poor asset quality associated with Indian MFIs, they realized very quickly that they needed to adapt their model and be more diverse. And so what they've done in the interim is they've diversified their product base. So now actually they have a minority portfolio allocation to microfinance, and they're doing vehicle leasing, they're doing affordable housing, although incremental home improvements. And they're also doing some SME financing. And this is proven to be not only a much more robust business model, but it's also good for the clients because you're creating more holistic products for clients and meeting their needs. But we're also seeing a lot of people go into ag financing. We're also invested in Advance, which is an SME holding company that is in 11, 12 countries across Africa and South Asia. And they've been doing a lot of work looking at specific products for agricultural clients. So they've been doing cocoa. They've been lending particularly for cocoa farmers in Cote d'Ivoire, tailoring the loan cycles and the way that they are dispersed to the crop patterns. And they're now looking to replicate that in the DRC as well. So I think product diversification and making sure that you're quick and nimble to meet the needs of your clients has been key. The second big theme I would say is the convergence with commercial banks or commercial entities. And I actually see this going both ways. So what's been really interesting for us in our markets, and particularly the more mature markets like Pakistan and India, we only cover Asia and South Africa, or Asia and Africa, is that you've seen a lot of the banks either purchasing small or majority stakes in microfinance institutions. And they're doing this because, number one, a lot of the regulators are increasing the mandate to have financial inclusion exposure, or because they see it as a distribution network, right? And that they can offer some of their savings products to these clients, and it helps them tap into a market that they would find too expensive to do on their own. So a good example of this is Habib Bank in Pakistan. We own a 5% stake in Habib, but Habib has just purchased the first microfinance bank of Pakistan. And I like this picture because it kind of has a dual purpose, because this is the mobile vans that First Microfinance Bank in Pakistan is bringing up to the valley in the north of Pakistan for agricultural clients. But this has become one of the big focuses of the bank going forward, because they very quickly saw after acquisition that this could be highly profitable for them, as well as reach the targets of the Pakistan regulator in terms of financial inclusion. We also see this in India with Ratnaka Bank, which is one of our largest investments. They've been doing two things. They've been lending to microfinance institutions, but they've also been purchasing small stakes in MFIs for the same objective. But on the flip side of that, we're seeing this convergence because we're seeing a lot of the microfinance institutions become banks themselves. So in India, you will probably have seen that a lot of the microfinance institutions that used to be non-deposit taking institutions, they've received licenses from the Reserve Bank for the first time, and well, the first time for microfinance institutions in history. And so now they're able to offer savings products and other lending products for the first time. And all of this means you have a much more scalable model. And the final theme we've seen is just the, I think, exponential inflow from commercial investors into the space. So if you go back 5 years ago when I first invested in the space, you were seeing a lot of subsidized capital, which is great, because I think this is the testament to where, in sort of Dowdy's first point, you need the subsidized capital to kickstart things, right? So you were seeing DFI money, you were seeing some foundation money, you were seeing social investor money that had, first loss components and all of the rest are TA components, which the sector needed. But today we're seeing the likes of Morgan Stanley, Claremont, TPG, GIC, all these guys are investing with absolutely no subsidized element to it. And in addition to that, last year, we've seen two, taps into the capital markets where we've seen Ujjivan and Equitas both IPOing. Ujjivan was almost 50 times oversubscribed, actually. And we've seen, and we know that there's quite a few others gearing up. So this is an evolution. And Dowdy's first point, which actually we didn't rehearse this, I did in fact tell him to be provocative, but he's absolutely right, which is it's okay to have some subsidy in the beginning years, but this should be the end game, that you are catalyzing private investors over time. So I've just painted a very rosy picture, but want to end on a a very honest note, which is there are many continued hurdles for growth. I've just told a lot of stories of South Asia, and that is because the market there is much more conducive to financial inclusion. We still see a lot of headwinds in Africa, which is our other key market. And the main reason for that, quite frankly, is the lack of population density. And the lack of population density equates to a much higher expense to servicing a loan. And that, coupled with the asset quality in the region, equates to almost a prohibitively expensive cost structure. And this is one of our biggest challenges, is how can we address that? Now, fintech has been quite exciting, and we've been doing a lot of work on what fintech means and what models are working. And I absolutely believe that fintech is the solution to addressing this affordability and accessibility in rural areas. But quite frankly, there's no proven business models yet. So this is the one to watch. We're doing everything we can to help understand, how we can integrate certain systems, what are going to be the winning business models, whether it's digital lending, savings, enabling products that allow you to access, clients in rural areas. But I think that there's, still a lot to be proven and to learn here. And in the same vein, you have product deepening. I think that, in the mobile space, payments, if you're going to go with any model that's made some sort of miles, you see payments. But how do you translate that into, or extend that into, actual products for clients? So how do you create savings products? How do you create loan products through digital lending? And even more nascent are these business models. And so extending the accessibility idea of mobile money into products that are actually meeting the needs of our clients, I think we are even further out from seeing that. But I'm hopeful these are some of the answers to our challenges. And the last point is around regulatory uncertainty. I mean, over the last 3 years, our portfolio has gotten hit so many times by regulatory sort of surprises, if you will. And don't get me wrong, we've seen when regulation is enforced in a way that is thought out and is in the interest of the client, it's extremely helpful. So I would actually say generally India since the AP crisis has been useful, right? The margin caps were done in a sensible way. The credit bureau being enforced, you can't borrow from multiple MFIs. All of this is great. What's not great is when you have interest rate caps introduced because of an election, and not thought out about the sustainability of a business model, which is what we saw in Zambia. What's not helpful is when you have demonetization and you don't think about what that's going to do to rural clients. And I think the increase in minimal capital requirements, which is what we see in a lot of our African MFIs, is also not helpful. And they usually come as a surprise, and they usually come during election years. And, a lot of the MFIs that have made a lot of ground end up getting sort of pushed 5 steps backwards. So this is another challenge that we're constantly being sort of faced with. And that's all for me. That's done.
Thank you, everyone. So I very much noticed that I am the last speaker that sits between your questions and then the refreshments. Actually, quick question. Is Dowdy, has he gone home or is he around? Oh, no, I'm really unlucky because actually, depends on how you look at things. But I thought it was very interesting that he was being provocative at the beginning, saying that don't just repackage stuff. And if there isn't a market, it probably means it's okay, fine, let's try and make the deals. And the reason why I thought that was interesting is that I was asked by Peter and friends to say, talk about energy. And I said, okay, so that's a very broad space. There's a lot you can do. What do you want to know? Where are the deals? Where are people making money? Again, quite broad, although some people are losing money in certain places and some people are making money in others. So what I've decided to do is look at particular areas coming from the kind of actor that is involved, not just at the strategy level. So we were introduced correctly as originally a strategic advisory firm. That was 17, 18 years ago, and we do a lot more nowadays. So I'm really bubbling up from the kind of work that we've been doing as structuring agents, transaction advisory, and saying, what are we seeing when we come back up and where the action is, right? And actually, it's in debt. And everyone knows when you start talking debt, you become the guy with the clipboard, the pen, you're a little bit less swashbuckling than Dowdy. You're like, restructuring is not so bad. And if there's no deal, I don't know if I want to be first, right? So it's a slightly different perspective. How you get people to be very balanced in how they assess market risk, credit risk, government risk, and sector risk, right? And still think about creating markets, especially when we're starting to talk about debt. So that's some of the interesting things we've been seeing in energy. Now, I'm going to be talking about energy access, because we are talking about impact investing as a thematic overarching what we're talking about today, right? So rather than, and there are very, very interesting things to be doing across the spectrum of energy activities. But I'm really going to talk a bit about thinking about energy access. Now, a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about is Africa-centric, but it's a story that goes writ large. But in Africa, we've got 600 million people that do not have access to electricity, depending on whoever's number you believe, but it's broadly in that kind of ballpark. And it's actually going to be growing, because although we see that in the do-nothing scenario, or as-is scenario, we expect that there will be more connections. Population will actually grow off-grid faster than that. Okay, so that's an interesting thing from the perspective of a problem. It's an interesting thing from the perspective of a market, because just because I'm off-grid doesn't mean that I'm not spending any money on energy. Now, don't worry too much about the mass of meccos and numbers. Whichever analyst put this together, they're going to have some words with me later. But the fundamental thing here is this, right? Sorry, I am throwing a bunch of random slides here from different projects together, but this was a piece of work that we did specifically in one country, it was actually Nigeria, and looking at the energy market in a particular collection or conglomeration of states. We cut them in a certain different way. And we were looking in this case at the residential market and the SME, or small commercial market. Fundamentally, when you look at people who are off-grid, they're still spending money on energy. And the percentage of households which were off-grid versus what we were calling bad grid, which was those households that had less than 4 hours of predictable energy per day. What was interesting is we're looking at, proportionately speaking, almost the same spend. And then we had on-grid electrified households who are still spending money on various other things. Now, part of that is use case as well. It's not all about lighting your house. Sometimes it's about cooking. You want solid fuel. You're not necessarily going to be using electricity for that. But for the most part, what we have here is a very interesting opportunity in terms of the fact that that 600 million household challenge is an enormous market. And a lot of different types of players are well aware of that and think about how do they address that. I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of segments today. The first is off-grid solar. I think that's one type of model that is relatively well known to most people in the room. I'm not going to take a long time to explain it, but essentially we are looking at dedicated systems that are deployed at a house or an individual locality level, typically serving one household, could be more than one business, could be more than one, and serves a particular individual household or unit with a certain amount of energy. Now, they can start from very, very small, focusing on just lights, to really quite elaborate systems that give you almost like an on-grid experience, depending on which actor and which system power you're looking at. Right. The interesting thing going on here is there's been some innovations in how we think about payments. Typically, those larger systems, which are quite exciting for those who are converting from already having, say, a generator and able to power a number of lights, maybe even a small fridge, aspirationally perhaps a TV, etc. They don't necessarily want to switch to a very small system, and they could have the paying capacity, given how much they're spending on petrol or kerosene, to spend money on a bigger system if they could smooth the payment stream. And pay-as-you-go systems are allowing that to happen, or pay-as-you-go models. And a lot of that starts to wed itself to the financial inclusion story that Maria was just talking about. I'm not going to talk about that, but it's super interesting. So we can always talk about that after this speech. Mini grids. So mini grids is an interesting one where we're talking about essentially a micro version of an entire national level or regional level grid. We're looking at generation capacity, transmission lines to serve a certain collective. Normally, topology matters. It should be a cluster of households and businesses. Some of these have a particular focus around an individual anchor client. It might be a business that has a pretty high demand for processing power, for example. So it could be rice husk processing, or it could be something that could be related to telecoms power generation for the telecoms network. But for the most part, what gets very exciting are the ones that don't just look at captive power for an individual business, but also start to extend beyond that to a various other number of households around it. Finally, we look at small-scale independent power producers. Now, I mean specifically small-scale. What we've been looking at here is not an entire landscaping of all the possible things that you could do in terms of small independent power producers, but what we've got here is work that we've been doing around renewable energy producers that are typically looking at a project size of under $30 million. And that we have tended to find is, for the most part, the project size that makes it very, very hard to be easily funded by the typical development finance institutions that you would normally go to. And you typically find that you are just struggling to get your projects financed. So this was an area that we were looking at in terms of trying to unlock as well. So what did we find when we looked at it from a debt perspective? So we were looking at how much debt was going into these areas over the last few years. It's 2010 to 2016. There's quite a lot of money overall. The off-grid solar sector accounted for about 200 to 250 million, mini grids up less than 100, and small-scale IPPs under 300. What's interesting was that off-grid solar was able to get quite a diversity of sources of capital. There's quite a number of different potential sources they were tapping, in particular DFIs, but impact investors were particularly key. And we're also starting to see, and this is very exciting, local and regional commercial banks. And when you dip into some of that, that was also some more experimental approaches to lending, with certain particular actors being able to blend capital, grants, guarantees, but really some very interesting things coming through there. IPPs, broadly a similar story, except for the 40% that was largely unknown but couldn't be accounted for, but we were pretty sure, although we couldn't diligence exactly every single dollar that went in, we were talking about something which was broadly similar to the composition that we had here in terms of development finance institutions and PPP partnerships. Mini grids, much more difficult, right? Very early stage. Still experimentation around seeing whether there is, as one DFI told us, we're not sure whether there is a there yet. So really the instrument class you should be thinking is much more risk tolerant than thinking about even concessional debt. We're still trying to innovate the models that are viable and scalable. There are some actors that are saying that on an individual site basis, we're getting to a point where we are EBITDA break even. Then when you add central overhead, no. But we haven't seen that really come through time and time again, right? So a lot of this was highly concessional debt. Now, just a little bit more deeper dive into what we're seeing sector by sector. When we look at off-grid solar, we were seeing 225 million following in, as you saw before. And really, then when you started to look really into that, this is our best view as of kind of middle of 2016. One or two actors tended to really be moving the dial at any one of those levels. So you could see some real forward-leaning players in terms of DFIs and in terms of impact investors that were really moving these areas. So it's really a small number of institutions and actors that were really driving that story. It wasn't yet quite diversified. When we looked at mini grids, it's pretty much a very narrowly described story. Okay, so we were looking at, for the most part, this characterizes what we're seeing here, but there wasn't a lot of big action there. But that's not a surprise given what we said before. And then we looked at IPPs. This was an area where there was a very interesting kind of cognitive dissonance, very much on mission, very much understand from a DFI's perspective, the IPP investment case, right? However, these smaller transaction sizes, it just made it hard for them to view them as bankable. The smaller deals become more difficult in terms of the risk involved, especially as it becomes harder to get public sector commitment and without the larger deals there. High complexity versus small size, very difficult. And you weren't getting, at least from some people's perspective, the caliber of teams behind the smaller deals versus what you could get behind the larger deals. So this was a very interesting case where the DFIs really did see an opportunity to see more activity there, but they didn't yet feel geared up to go after it. So when we start to talk about opportunities, we've got a story about how much capital was going in. So that's the supply side, but I haven't yet talked about the demand side. We did a little bit of modeling. It's always, of course, going to be wrong in terms of its precision, but the broad story is this. When we were looking at where the demand for debt was going to be across those three sectors in a medium-term horizon out to 2022, so a 5-year perspective, we're essentially looking at about $3.5 billion of demand. And historically, we'd seen a supply about half. Right? So where is the extra money going to be coming from? Well, we're going to see a significant uptick, was the first thing. What was very interesting was, with all the hype, we thought that, we called it the wall of money hypothesis. Is there really space for another sizable fund in an environment where everybody's very interested in these three areas, right? Again, remember, the very concerned but very cautious, but wanting to be risk-leaning debt investor. These were the existing commitments that we saw, and a lot of promises, right? So we saw some things which were likely at the time, and of course this is all now revised and to be changed, but fundraising at that time, and then we took our fundraising adjustment, take 25% off that at least, and that gets us to about 1.5. But the broad story was that we're seeing at least a couple of billion in terms of a supply gap, right? So that was the debt need we saw before. We were seeing a commitment in terms of increased debt funding going into the sector of about $600 million, about 150 extra that we thought was quite likely, and some fundraising with a remaining gap of about 2 billion. That's where the action is, right? And that's interesting because, and I haven't done the similar analysis on equity because it would just take too long. This is many orders of magnitude larger, right? I'm not going to go into the details of this slide, but then we started mapping out, okay, what are the things that you need to be thinking about to really crack this case? Right, how do we think about where we want to go in off-grid solar? I think the story that we've got at that point was, this is probably not massive in terms of a mini-grid story in the next 5 years for debt. There's probably grants and IPPs, there's massive opportunity there. So there's a lot of opportunity given just the sheer debt size, right? But depending on which sector you were looking at, it was a different lever that you really needed to emphasize in your thinking to start to crack open those opportunities. Now, this is a perspective that is much more at the fund perspective rather than an individual deal, but they still matter depending on whether you're looking at it, the individual transaction or you're looking at it more broadly speaking. But what we saw there was very interesting in terms of $2 billion. Again, I want to just have that word of warning, or just temper our enthusiasm a little bit, because of course, that's the past-looking story and projecting some stuff into the future. But of course, don't forget one thing that I absolutely agree with in terms of the opening around impact, thinking about impact, and thinking clear-eyed around where are you being catalytic. You have to look very hard at these models. There was a lot of innovation. There has been a lot of very exciting innovation in things such as pay-as-you-go, off-balance sheet structures that could admit to taking on quite a lot of debt, customer receivables. Very, very exciting. It sounds a little bit like a world that you lived in not too long ago. And what we think, or what some of us think at Dalberg, is it's just going to be very interesting to see the risk tolerance when you put in things such as the overlap between off-grid and agriculture, and therefore covariant risk, agronomic events, things like that. That starts to really test the strength of those systems. And what consumer credit market doesn't go through some kind of an event every 8 to 10 years, right? So we need to see what will happen when we come through. So throwing a lot of money and trying to fill the $2 billion gap, we weren't quite that enthusiastic. But thinking about how you could experiment in different models and promote different ways of getting capital into those, I think there was a lot of money to be made. And that was our view.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. Now we're going to open up for the Q&A for about 20, 25 minutes. So if you've got questions, do line them up, and in the traditional fashion, stick up your hand, and Marina will help out. So if anyone's got any questions, then do stick your hand up. I have a few lined up because people tend to be a bit shy to start with, and then they usually open up. So I guess one of the questions on certainly the top of my mind, and possibly others, is what would you invest in today? What do you think is an absolutely fantastic investment today? And what is a dog that everyone's charging into that you should avoid like the plague? So I think I'll pass to Ali Khan initially on that.
By the way, Jesse from MCOPA just walked by.
Now I'm really concerned.
One of our off-grid investments CEO just walked by.
Yeah, I think that picking up on the theme that I was talking about before, but also Marina's theme as well. I think it's just more of a systemic view that I would say, right? Which is, if you really are going to be aggressively both impact and return seeking, I think that the interesting thing is to go where people aren't necessarily going. I think it's a constant theme that's come out in different ways. Marina's talked about the hype cycle, as it were, or lending practices that needed to be somewhat better calibrated. Jyoti's talked about the opportunities that have existed by really starting to think about well-designed products in a market where there just wasn't sufficient thinking about how do you open that up. And really, I think where we've been seeing the most exciting things are taking that approach. So there are certain things that we've seen in, for example, energy, where there's been a lot of capital following. And that's not necessarily where we think that you're going to get the best value. But it's also not necessarily the area where you're going to see necessarily also the most interesting opportunities for impact. But it depends if you're going to be a fast follower or if you're going to be a pioneer. I don't know. Maybe afterwards.
So would you summarize that by saying there's a lot of money piling into off-grid solar without necessarily too much forensic attitude to what the product is? And perhaps there are opportunities in mini grids and others where there may be interesting opportunities. Is that a fair summary of what you just said, or?
I'd almost give you an example of another way of looking at it. So we were working with a private equity player that was looking very closely at off-grid. So we're quite interested to think that they thought it was ready for private equity. And actually, when they really looked under the hood, they decided, no, it wasn't quite ready. So it's not the case that everyone's just piling in. And it just depends. I really do come back to that. It does depend on your business model. Early stage venture capital type players that really want to get in there and think through the challenges, work very closely with the team, build that team strength and build the institutional heft to be really able to do this. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but those that maybe come in with that type of model, but expecting the kind of multipliers that pay for it when there isn't enough space, maybe that isn't right. So it is quite a complicated thing, and that's why I'm not going to generalize.
Very good. Maria, what are you saying?
Well, I think my answer is going to be in the same vein, which is, in the fintech and the unproven business models. I mean, there's a lot of buzz and there's a lot of money going into, or at least speculating at, the fintech sector. And I guess when you really look under the hood, again, you see that in things like payments. Very few people have actually broken even. It's a scale game because the margins are quite thin, and it's hard to get to scale because of regulatory constraints and M&O dynamics and all sorts of other things. And so we're cautious. And digital lending, the same. There's all sorts of great ideas around utilizing social media and other things to predict credit behavior, but actually the only proof is that if you use historic payment information, that's predictive of credit behavior. And so we are cautious. Now, I'm sure somebody will, people will break the code and try and fail and try again and have different versions. But we are cautious about jumping into sort of put our money behind anything.
And what about positive areas you think you would encourage people to look at? You're excited about?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think so in the financial inclusion space, anybody that's diversifying their product base, as I mentioned, I mean, we've put a lot of money over the last 2 years into what would have been traditional microfinance providers, but actually are now looking at, things like agriculture that are looking at SMEs or MSMEs, vehicle leasing, and offering a more holistic product base. So anybody that's looking at more diversified.
Josie, I don't know whether you want to speak to that or not. You may if you like.
But I think I have long bemoaned the fact that most of the investment vehicles have always taken what is considered the low-hanging fruit, which is investing in micro enterprise loans. And I think they have done a huge disservice by not sort of pushing the microfinance institution to do more diversified product offering. I think what we've seen within our own practice, within affordable housing, is that when you really have a good design product, you can see scale and you can see product performance. You can see good repayment. So I feel the movement from microfinance institution has to go into more diversified offering, because I think traditionally we've always provided, we think that we can provide poor people something, and because they have no choice, they will take it. And I think that is doing the low-income families a really huge disservice. In terms of looking at what we are seeing as very fascinating is the kind of entrepreneurs that we are seeing in the affordable housing space that are creating products and services. The one that I talked about is this company in India, which is doing roofing. They are creating modular roofing that can be moved from any place with agriculture and packaging waste. When I first met the entrepreneur, his question was that people come and want to invest in my company, but they always ask me, the second question is, what will be our exit? I mean, there can't be any exit if the entrepreneur has just begun doing the product, So I think, although patient capital is a really terrible word, but this is the kind of capital that entrepreneurs really need, without seeking the Silicon Valley kind of exit. So I think we are seeing a lot in the affordable housing space itself that are looking at floors, roofs, eco toilets, and so on. So we're very excited.
That's certainly something that we echo in the work that we do at Panapur, and Snowball's another role I have, which is we say to our investees, we're not interested in exit. We don't ever want to exit you. Why would we? If there may be an opportunity to exit, which sits with your needs and the business's needs, but we don't want to be in a position where you're exiting because of something written in a document which says you have to exit at the year 10. And that's, I think that's a structural issue, actually, in a lot of the private vehicles we're trying to address by being a long-term patient investor.
And people are saying, oh, what kind of valuation model do you use? What kind? Even with a solid company that are publicly trading, you can't look at discounted cash flow model and say, oh, this is the best model to use. I think there is a lot that is happening. People are bringing capital, but their expectations are just unreasonable. So what we have done with the Shelter Venture is to create a facilitation where if the entrepreneur feels that they want like a convertible note, we say, take that, but make sure that you put it to good use. So there's definitely going to be a lot of monitoring involved, but we don't dictate that we want to invest as a preferred equity shareholder or a pure equity shareholder. We make sure that we are putting the kind of capital that best meets the need of the entrepreneur. So, and it's easy to do when you have donated money.
Very good.
I just, at the risk of us being an echo chamber, I just want to ask something a bit. Is that, yeah. I just want to ask a question though around here, because at the end it's great for us to say, with a halo on, we want to be more patient. We want to support you for the long run. Microfinance institutions should be doing more. But at the end, some people got to run a business, and people need to be able to realize the value of those investments, right? So one of the things that I wonder is there better ways of us thinking about how we bring together those who really do have to actually adhere to those commercial market norms and those who have a very different mandate? And then we see a lot of this distortion by those people with a mixed mandate, right? Because they've always got this internal tension between finding great quality deals and additionality, right? And so, with a microfinance institution, I wonder whether part of the problem is, we asked them to do, I remember with one of our energy access projects, they said, look, if we were starting to provide that kind of lending, as soon as there's some after sales care, we're not geared up for after sales care. They just think it's broken. And then they just say that, well, you've given me something faulty, and then they default on the whole loan. So we'd rather not just get into that at all. So maybe there's just a question around, are the microfinance institutions the ones that are not being ambitious enough? Or is it actually that they need to be more selective about where they go?
For us, in the affordable housing, in the microbuild fund, so the technical assistance that we provide also goes to the borrowing clients. At the bare minimum, they get a construction education on how to build sustainably. Like, for example, it will be an illustration of a booklet, how much sand can be mixed with cement. Also, people have aspirational needs. They want to build with concrete when concrete is probably not the most conducive product to build. So our job is to educate. But one of the challenges amongst the good things that have happened with Microbuild Fund is the challenge that we are not able to provide construction technical assistance at scale. Why? Because it's easy to do when you have 20 clients and to have an engineer go and visit 20 clients, but it's hard to do when you have 20,000 clients, and it can't be done. So what we have done as Habitat is to conduct Mason training. For example, we provide, when you typically see incremental build, you will see one Mason serving 20 households in a village in India, for example. So that's not feasible, because that's prolonging the project for the family. What we have done is provide Mason training, and they go and train other Masons in the financial institution. So to your question, microfinance institutions' core business is lending. Their core business is not construction. So we do see that as a challenge, but we are finding ways to mitigate it. At the bare minimum, we give construction advice to the borrowing clients in form of education.
Thank you. I can speak to that, but are there other questions out there? Because I can ask this lady in the front, and then there's two, anyone else? Three. So we'll take this lady, and that lady, and then we'll do three, and then we'll come back to you, okay? So this lady in the front, first question. So ask your question, and then the lady behind you will ask hers, and the lady over there will ask hers, and then we'll try and answer them.
Excellent. So in the first presentation, Alison said that only... Okay. I never used one, so first time. So in the first presentation, Alison said that only 40% of the social aspect was being measured. So I wanted to know what 2 or 3 main activities are currently being conducted to standardize social impact metrics.
Okay.
Thank you for a very interesting panel. My question was on how we could catalyze ecosystem partnerships like Habitat has, right? So there's an impact investor, there's an NGO providing technical support, there's a social enterprise doing this, that to de-risk, because you did mention, for example, the capital requirements in most African countries going up, right? And that's because the government has a reactive approach to controlling risk. So how do we have a proactive way to involve all these people? And you also mentioned, for example, the regional banks that were going into this space. And I used to work for one, and it was a mixture of a blended grant with an NGO and a credit risk guarantee. So how do we see more of these things happening?
Hi. Thank you. That was a really interesting panel. I've got a particular interest because I'm a founder. Hi. I've got a particular interest because I'm a founder of a small MFI in Ghana. So it was really interesting what you were saying about the increase in capital requirements, which actually I particularly think is a good thing for consolidation in quite an overheated market. But what would be interesting is to get the panel's perspective, because I didn't hear so much about the impact of those of us that are regulated as being deposit taking. Because I think that for me, it's quite interesting when you go out in the field and sometimes 60% of your clients, they don't want a loan. They just want somewhere safe to rest their money.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question about some sort of standardization around impact metrics. I'm going to ask Ali Khan that question, but you don't have to answer it first. I'll give you a moment to think about that. Second question is how to catalyze ecosystem development around the habitat model. So Jyoti, could you speak to that, and Maria also? And then the third question was around the impact of deposit-taking institutions and MFI developing deposit-taking capability. And Maria, if you could speak to that. So we'll start with Jyoti, how to create ecosystems, if you could speak to that.
Thank you for that question, and thank you, Paul. So Habitat is distinctly privileged because it has such a great brand name and a deep, deep sector expertise within the US. So for us to be able to partner with other organizations like Omidyar Network that had similar interest in property right was a very natural fit. In terms of OPIC, everybody tells us that OPIC has never ever done a $90 million loan to any single entity. But I also feel that speaks to the credibility that Habitat has built over its existence. So, and also it is, I think it is reflective in the way that the figures and the numbers have presented themselves. You want to, whenever, in my opinion, I think you have to find a partner that have similar mindset and similar goals. Neither of the investors that we have currently in our fund were looking to say, oh, we want to make X times the return. They all came with some sort of, how shall I say, an agenda that they had vested interest. MetLife Foundation is looking at it from corporate responsibility, but they have also partnered with us in our US FlexCap fund. So for them, they knew Habitat, and then they wanted to do something similar. So to answer your question, you have to find partners that are similarly interested in creating that kind of ecosystem. You know, Habitat, because it has its sector expertise is in housing, so it makes it easier. But I think I don't think one could say that about general MFIs that are only providing financial services.
And would it be fair to say that you're 5 years into this thing, but if this succeeds and delivers any of the goals you're trying to, you'd be happy to do it 20 times over, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but maybe
and share the knowledge with others.
Absolutely. I think that was the whole goal, to demonstrate this to the larger sector, that there can be these and an affordable housing product can be commercially viable. We are doing a case study with Kenya and Uganda with the MasterCard Foundation, a grant that we did to build the technical capacity of the institutions there, and I think it will be widely available. But the point is, because this was a demonstration fund, so it has only 10-year life. It will finish at 10 years, and we would have then disseminated knowledge to the sector at large. At the half mark of the fund, we believe that it has surpassed our own projections. So we are very delighted. But yeah, I mean, who knows, a micro mortgage fund or another microbill too, which also probably demonstrates to the other micro investment vehicle that they can come in with not just debt, with longer term capital, because with debt comes covenants. You can only go to a certain market, you can only cap, you can't do X% of foreign currency loan. And so these are the challenges that you mentioned, Maria, were also the ones that we have faced, you know, and we can't just take the risk because we want to make sure that we preserve the capital in order to pay OPIC its $90 million back, but still evidence and illustrate the goal that we have set for ourselves in creating a market for affordable housing.
Thank you. It's interesting from an investor perspective. I don't know if any of you invest in microfinance debt, particularly top tier debt, particularly hard currency investing. It's actually quite hard, very hard actually, to make decent returns. So in a way, from an investor perspective, investor has to innovate. Has to look for opportunities, has to look for sections of balance sheets. So actually, it works quite well.
So even in microbill's case, I'll just give one example. So we can't do. There are some countries where we cannot do hedge loans because they are prohibitively expensive in terms of pricing. So we had a corporate donor that said, "Well, we want you to work in X country, and here's $100,000. So we came back with a proposition that why don't you give us $1 million, and then we can create a $10 million sub portfolio within the microbill fund where we can do internal hedging. How does that work? Well, we create like a correlation matrix of currencies where you are one currency gain will offset another currency's loss. So we are creating that within Habitat. So the 10 million will go into currencies that are very volatile. And well, it may not, it doesn't give us the pricing that we want, but it at least provides the social impact aspect, where we are able to create a system for microfinance institutions that really want to offer, are committed to offering housing and can do so without worrying about pricing. So I wouldn't say that it's subsidized capital, but it is covered with an internal hedging mechanism.
Thank you. I'm going to skip straight to the next question. Maria, could you talk about the impact of deposit taking? I think the question is around the expansion of the license to be able to take deposit taking from what were previously non-banking financial type institutions, MFIs, getting banking license and deposit taking.
Well, was that the question, or was the question more that you have a deposit taking license, so your clients want savings and they don't want loans? Of deposits. Yeah. No, I mean, it's so interesting, right? Because if you look at a lot of the African countries versus South Asia, where they haven't been allowed to take deposits for a very long time, it's much more, it's so intuitive, right? Because you have a lot of very poor clients that haven't had any place to put their money for, ever. And now for the first time, they're able to, put their money into a formal account. And to me, this is intuitively much more impactful, right? But how you measure it over time is a very good question, right? So I can't say that we don't actually, as an institution, measure that granularly. We can't, because we invest in however many, 65 countries in however many institutions, and we can never get quite that granular. But we do track the amount of deposits, and the idea being that if you track it over time and you track it by client over time, that the increased liquidity and the increased net worth at a minimum reduces vulnerability, right? I mean, you certainly can't say that it's going to bring anybody out of poverty, but at least you can make the correlation that you're reducing vulnerability over time. And then, of course, I start asking the questions around what are they doing with the extra savings. Almost always, as we know, it's putting kids through school and through other things that have a multiplier effect. But quite honestly, as an industry, we haven't done a good job of creating empirical evidence around that. That actually bridges into the next question, if you don't mind me doing that, which is just the how are we, making a more consistent impact assessment over the sector. And I think there again, as in a sector, we've done a pretty poor job of organizing ourselves around that historically. And the reason is, like investors like us, it's our fault, because you take CDC. Is one of the large DFIs, and all of our peers. Well, we have our own mandate in terms of what we measure in impact, which is jobs. And so that's because we as an organization don't just do microfinance, we do consumer businesses and healthcare and education and infrastructure. And so how do you take one, measurement that you can look at across our portfolio? And then we have all of our sub-indicators. But then our friends at the European Investment Bank and IFC and everybody else have completely different indicators. And then that trickles down to the private equity investors, because they have to report into us and all the rest. And so then you end up with thousands of indicators and all asking the same people for this. Now, there's a lot of industry bodies that are addressing this and that are trying to make a more consistent framework. SPI4, Cerise, there's people working on trying to create a succinct and pragmatic list of indicators that all of us are signing up to. So we're making progress. There's been a lot of work on this over the last 5 years, and I think we're coming to a better place. But I have sympathy for anybody who's working with all of us, quite frankly. And it's not great for us either, because then we can't tell as a sector, we can't tell a very good story. We can't be honest about measurement. But I think we're making some progress.
Thank you. Ali Khan, would you like to speak to that?
I mean, it's not your fault. It's a fractal problem. It really is, though. It really is. So let's try and, you've got the heterogeneity of your objectives, the heterogeneity of sectors, different instruments. How about you just think about, let's go back to the other example, just debt in off-grid solar pay-as-you-go systems. Surely we can find 3 good metrics. I mean, non-performing loans, this and the other. No, you can't. What's an NPL? How do you measure it? has someone who's not made the last 2 payments, is that an NPL? Is that the way? Or is it actually the best thing to do is to look at days since last payment? Well, it depends who you're talking about. It depends on your payment model, and depends on how you've architected your solution. It depends on how you deal with recoveries, etc. The detail is nefarious, right? And in addition to that, the desire of individual companies to share all that data in order to standardize it is understandably not that forthcoming. So it's one of these things where I think it's always going to be a struggle, and people should be, let's keep trying. Let's definitely keep trying. But I don't think you're necessarily going to say that in 10 years we will have global gap. You know, we'll have our standards around it, because it's inherently going to be hard. I just want to ask one clarifying question. So the lady before asked about how do we find fund structures like this and standardize them? Was that the question, right? So it hasn't been released yet, but we've done a piece of work which looks at what OEC did when they looked at 150 odd or 200 blended finance deals and structures. Convergence did about 100 or so, and then Dalberg did it. So we just brought it all together as a meta-analysis to answer that question. And I'm sorry, folks, it's just not an easy answer. Right? You've got some very, very simple tools. Let's just shove in a credit guarantee. Right? And it's worked here, kind of. I don't know, haven't tested it. She hasn't given me the metric. But we tried, and then we will carry on replicating that in a number of somewhat different scenarios, right? On the other end of the spectrum, we should take a very, very nuanced understanding of all the different actors with all their different objectives, and really think about a solution that is going to be very well fitted to the situation. The first one is easy to replicate, relatively cheap transaction cost, low efficacy when you start to move it around. The other one, very, very complicated. Part of the complexity is that you are bringing different actors with different objectives into alignment. So that coordination challenge is a feature, not a bug. That's the part of the thing, right? We're talking about blended finance, but commercial senior tranches, and we've got others doing something completely different, right? The things that will work, though, are the humble things of 100 small different improvements. You know, we don't have any standard way of negotiating what the norms are, because very few actors have really been trying to benchmark how you think about tenor, how you think about, you know, the underlying product. Well, we've been working with actors like CDC, and that's exactly the kind of questions you want to know. But no one's really been saying what's normal. No one's been saying what's normal in terms of a contract structure. Every development finance institution has a legal team that is very fiercely protective of its nuanced differences in every single term. And that can create situations where, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank, IFC, supported by Gatsby and Starbucks and Ecom, have a fantastic facility. It takes 2 years to get the legal negotiations done. And they haven't deployed a single dollar yet, because the prudential lending requirements have changed over time. So everything that you originally wanted to do, they can't do. So we've got all these little things that we need to change rather than one big panacea.
Thank you. Stephen has a question, and are there other questions? This will be the last opportunity to ask a question of the panel. Sam has one.
Thank you.
Yep.
Can I go ahead now?
Yes, absolutely.
So I've really enjoyed hearing about how you guys make a change in your kind of everyday business and how your investments change people's lives. I'm interested in how you guys might interact with institutions to make changes that might be more scalable than, say, investing in a house for an individual, or making a investment in a particular product, if that makes sense.
So how to invest in institutions rather than...
Yeah, for example...
hold the microphone right close to your mouth, please.
Sure. Businesses traditionally invest in institutions, like, for example, via lobbying and philanthropy to make the changes that they want for their returns. Do you think there are opportunities for social investors to perform similar activities to scale their investments?
And there was another question? Yeah, Sam.
Hello. I'd just like to say thank you to the panel. I'm a bit of a layman when it comes to impact investing. And I think that might sort of come out in my questions. So my view, obviously, is that if I was an investor, surely there would be no other reason to invest in something other than to make an impact, right? I can see that. I mean, obviously that might be quite naive. Obviously I can see other reasons why people might want to make a return. And I guess, I think it was mentioned in one of the earlier questions about commercial norms. So my question is, how do we change those commercial norms to move people to more of a sort of impacting investment view? Is it just through offering it more at scale, or is there more of a cultural issue there?
Okay, so thank you for your question. I may even take a stab at the second one. The first question, my understanding is how do we enable more social change through investing through institutions? Does anyone want to take that question?
I think the two questions are linked, to be honest. I think if I'm judging your question correctly, which is, I think, how do you make, I don't know if I'm linking the two, and to answer your question more directly, I don't think that commercial and impact returns are mutually exclusive by any means. And especially in emerging markets or underdeveloped regions of the US or the UK, if you're investing in underserved segments, I think actually if you're looking at the two as mutually exclusive, you're missing a trick. So let's take financial inclusion, for example. If you are focused on how to make good financial returns, you're focused on asset quality. What does that mean? Making sure that your client can repay. Well, making sure your client can repay is actually should be one of your social objectives as well, that they're not over indebted, that the products are tailored appropriately for them, and all of the rest. And you can go on to the other metrics. They're the KPIs that you would look at for good financial returns for any financial institution. So by no means are the two mutually exclusive. It's just we tend to segregate the two when we're talking about how we measure development. And I think that's why it links to your question, which is, for us, we only invest in companies and institutions where we have a commercial return in mind. And actually, we have pretty high bar in terms of commercial objectives. It's just we, in addition to that, push them to measure on what we call sort of impact. But again, the two are very closely linked.
A couple of words from the other panelists before I'll wrap up, and then we'll go for a drink.
I don't know, maybe I'm just getting tired and philosophical, but to answer that question maybe in a slightly different way. One of the original reasons why Dalberg was founded was really on the belief that if we apply private sector type approaches to solve intractable development challenges, or at least development challenges, some of which may appear more intractable than others, we could find some interesting new types of thinking. This was 20 years ago. Interesting new types of thinking to bring to the table. I want to be very careful when I work in a place like Dalberg that we don't then elide private sector type approaches to the private sector and say that there is an ability to create a uniform view of impact. If we just take the long-term sustainable view, and others may take a different view, but I just think that we ought to be clear-eyed and drop the romance that there is a simple way of just, if we only reframe the prism, we could get everyone to get along. Sometimes the public sector just has to be the way that you need to address certain creations of certain public goods. And sometimes it's certain activities driven by the public sector that will create things that we didn't even know but could be innovative and really spark incredible new opportunities. 8 of the key technologies out of a series of others, but 8 of the core technologies that made the iPhone possible came out of DARPA. Apple didn't pay for a single one, right? But they're leveraging all of that to create that value. And they would not have independently created it up front, right? So there's different motivations for different things. When we come back down to where we are here, I guess I'm just advocating for this blended approach. There are different institutions trying to adopt different ways of driving impact. I think bringing them into alignment with private sector-led approach, but being realistic about the different objectives that they do. The CDC's got a range of ways in which it interacts. There's direct investments, there's intermediated, there's a range of different ways it does that. I think that's exactly how we've got to do it, rather than try and say that we can reframe it and bring it into alignment.
Very briefly, I think I concur with both the other panelists because I agree that return and impact cannot be mutually exclusive. Eventually, we do want people to work their way out of poverty, and the way to do it is to provide them meaningful goods and services, not just saying that they can take this and live with it. I think there has to be some, but the focus should just not be only on returns because that's what Wall Street and other types are doing, right? Their focus, Silicon Valley probably, is just to create a platform where returns are the only expectation. I think the triple bottom line approach is going to be much more sustainable for all actors eventually. So, yeah.
And I'll speak briefly to particularly Sam's question before we wrap up. I think the answer to your question is how do we get, my understanding of the question is how do we get capital to look at risk, return, and impact, and all capital to do that. And it's something that I basically do every day, is trying to solve that problem. So our belief is you do it through a number of different ways. You can do it culturally. I know people who I call shrinks, who basically spend time with people who work in asset management, financial services, trying to enable them, to give them permission to do what they actually want to do, which is to act alongside their values. They feel they check their values at the door when they go into that institution. So that would be a way. It's through education and so on. Specifically, what we're doing is we think in financial services, particularly asset management, which generally speaking, I think are very lacking in innovation area, is what you do is you innovate, you succeed, you make money, and then they all copy you. So what we're trying to do, where I'm working, is to create a public market vehicle where everyday investors can invest, make a reasonable return, and if we succeed tremendously, then everyone will copy us. And our goal is to be made redundant because we're so successful, because they will just copy us and be better at us. That's our approach. So I understand the question, I applaud it, and we've got a long way to go yet, but I think that's possibly the way forward. So thank you very much to the panelists, thank you to the people online, thank you to the audience, thank you to CDC for hosting us, thank you in advance. I can see there's a couple of nice drinks out there. We appreciate that. We're going to have to wrap up now. I've run over by 15 minutes. I apologize to anyone here. I had about 3 or 4 more questions, including a Donald Trump impression, but you're not going to get that. Yeah. It was all about hands and huge and et cetera, et cetera. So to wrap up, I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. Please remember that pledge email you developed at the beginning of the work you had to do. Our next event is on the state of financial inclusion in the United Kingdom, 10 years on from Northern Rock. We don't have a date yet, but it's towards the end of October. Watch out for your emails on that one. We also host quarterly breakfast sessions for people who are really deeply involved in financial inclusion. It's a Chatham House Rules breakfast where we can discuss really what's going on in the sector. So if you're really interested deeply in financial inclusion, it's a great resource. The slides will be available later. And finally, before we go to drinks, 2 things. Finally, one is we are recruiting for very part-time resource to support the Financial Inclusion Forum. So if you're interested, particularly, for example, you might be a student who's looking to do part-time work to support our work, then we'd be very interested in talking to you, particularly people online. By all means, contact us. And finally, please would you thank our panelists in the traditional fashion? And join us for a drink outside.